Hello and welcome to Media Monitor on the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial. This is where we take a look inside the world of media, analysing the trends, the issues and the reporting of some of the week's top stories. I'm Piet Ndoro and this is what's coming up on the show today. We'll be connecting with a couple of young South Africans to find out if they think that youth voices are represented in the media. And then the story of the Tembisa 10 continues to hog the headlines, and it's taken quite a turn this past week. But we'll also be hearing from independent media and how this story has played out. They've alleged that there's been a state cover-up in the birth of these decuplets. We'll also have our regular feature on the program, and that's of course is the Back in History. And also don't forget, you can engage with us on social media. We want you to be part of this program as well, and the hashtag to use is hashtag SABC Media Monitor, hashtag SABC Media Monitor. Okay, so that is what's coming up in the program a little bit later on. Before all of that, let's catch you up with what's on the front pages of your newspapers, because a lot of you may not catch those newspapers. So let's start with the Sunday Times. And the Sunday Times front page is a story about DNA test results and how they're failing victims. In this case, it seems that justice for a 14-year-old teen who was allegedly raped over several months by 3 neighbors is hanging in the balance because of an almost 2-year delay in crucial DNA tests. The paper says that the long-awaited results of the tests will establish who made the schoolgirl pregnant, as it was conducted on a fetus following the abortion. The City Press's front page story is about the embattled church pastor Shepherd Bushiri, who has escaped South Africa yet again. Yeah, the paper says that sources claim that the fugitive preacher has been sneaking in and out of the country and has even managed to evade state security after officials ignored a tip-off. That's incredible. All right, let's take a look at the Sunday Independent. The Sunday Independent is leading with a story about how the Gauteng province is reeling under the grip of a third wave of COVID-19. There's a surge of numbers of the coronavirus infections, and hospitals, both private and public, are under quite a bit of stress in and around Johannesburg, some of them actually reporting to be full. Let's take a look at the Sunday Tribune. That's also running a COVID-19 story, but their focus is on schools, and they're reporting on how schools are to remain open and all teachers will be vaccinated by the 8th of July. But stakeholders in the sector say that they'll be keeping an eagle eye on the department to ensure that they remain on the straight and narrow. The Weekend Argus is also carrying a story regarding schools and vaccines. The paper says the Western Cape will have a massive task of vaccinating more than 55,000 teachers and employees in the educational sector over the next 2 weeks, starting on Wednesday. And this after the Minister for Basic Education, Zulaikha, in a media briefing yesterday, announced that a vaccination program for the education sector would target 582,000 workers nationally, and that the schools would remain open until the 8th of July. The Sunday World, well, that's leading with a story saying that the ANC is pushing to charge the suspended Secretary-General Ace Magashule, this for suspending President Cyril Ramaphosa. Do you remember when he did that? Almost straight in retaliation. And they also say that he breached the conditions of his suspension. So he brought the party into disrepute, and NEC is meeting this week. And no doubt that that's going to be part of their deliberations. So an ANC push to charge the suspended Secretary General, Ace Magashule. Now, following the advent of democracy in 1994, the new democratic government declared 16 June as National Youth Day and June as Youth Month. Now, the declaration is to honour the contribution of the youth in the struggle for the liberation of South Africa. Fast forward to 2021, and South Africa, like other countries on the continent, is a very youthful country, with around 64% of the population being under 35. Youth in South Africa are defined as people aged between 14 and 34, and according to Stats SA data, they make up 35.1% of the population. So, when it comes to the media, is the age group properly served? Do you have a voice commensurate with their size? Do their issues get fair coverage in the media? And other questions are, do they get represented in the media in the way that they would like themselves to be seen? What more could be done to make sure that youth voices and youth issues are seen in mainstream media? Well, let's find out from two young South Africans what they think. And we catch up with Thabo Shingange, who's the national spokesperson of the South African Union of Students, and also someone who is an activist for social justice and anti-racism. She's joining us on the line. She's also an author and on the BBC's 100 Women list of 2016, Zulaikha Patel. To both of you, a very good morning. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
A very good morning.
Good morning, thank you.
All right. In fact, let me start on the line. Ladies first. Zulaikha, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And this is a question for both of you. As young people, do you think the media gives enough voice to young people?
A very good morning to you. Thank you for having me. I must send my greetings to Thabo. In terms of that, for me, I do believe that we do have a voice, and our issues do get reported. However, I don't necessarily think that we are represented the way we should be represented when the movements that we lead find their way on the news. I don't think that we necessarily have control over narratives that are meant to represent us.
All right. Okay. So for you, it's more about representation. What about you, Thabo? What's your take? Do you think your voices are represented, are heard enough in the media?
First and foremost, good morning, Peter, and good morning to Zulaikha and everybody watching. Thank you very much for having us. I think I have a slightly different opinion to my colleague Zulaikha over there in terms of the fact of how so first and foremost, yes, I think there is instances and moments where young people are given platform in terms of the media. I mean, for instance, today we have two young people who are, being represented in the media space. However, more often than not, the media is often guilty of how it portrays the voices of young people and portrays the agency of young people in this country. In fact, more often than not, you find the media, and I call it almost an obsession around, stereotyping young people in this country. And for me, I come from a background of higher education, where you'd find when you're reporting on issues of young people in the higher education space, the interest of the media, for the most part, is around protests, is around the negative stereotyping of young people. You have very little instances where there are positive portrayals of the many initiatives that young people are taking up in their various spaces, right? Instead, you have the media more fixated on portraying the negative aspects and the negative stereotyping of young people in that sense. And so you find that the media then plays into this role of stigmatizing the youth around various notions, various stereotypes, various beliefs, and in that sense shaping dominant public opinion as youth as being this danger to society or danger to communities. Words such as protest, vandals and thugs and so forth do have a negative impact on how we understand youth issues and how we understand the agency and the development of the youth. So yes, I agree with Zulaikha in saying that we are not often portrayed the way the youth should be portrayed. as one of the biggest categories in the country, and the catalyst of course, catalyst of change, positive change in that aspect. So I think there is a disjuncture in terms of the many different viable things that youth are doing, entrepreneurial opportunities that the youth are doing, development opportunities that the youth are doing, which are not finding expression in the media, which are not being covered or given that opportunity. And so I think that there's that disjuncture that needs to be spoken into.
All right. So representation, also another issue. Zulaikha, then I wonder, what do you think is going wrong? Why is it that you're not properly represented? Is it the people that are writing the news are just not your age, or it's people that are playing up to people older? I don't know. What do you think it could be?
For me, I also have to agree with the points that Thabo has just made in terms of how youth are always portrayed in a sense of being a danger to community, a danger to society whenever there's protest action involved, where necessarily the attention is never on what the response young people get. For example, when young people are shot at, when young people are arrested, the focus is not on those that are perpetuating the violence onto young people. However, the focus tends to be on how young people respond to the violence that is perpetuated onto them. And all the time, young people are never armed, are simply just demanding a better standard of living. And I believe that the problem lies in representation in terms of us forming part of the media space, in terms of writing the news. There's not necessarily a lot of young people that write the news. And when I say young, I mean young in terms of below 30. And also, furthermore, in terms of the political arena of the country, which largely influences the news that is written, there isn't representation in the political arena where young people make up the smallest percentage of people in the political arena and decision making, which ultimately influences the narrative that's being written in the media.
Okay, so that the people whose voices that are supposed to represent the youth are much older, and therefore their voice gets heard instead of young people. All right, that's a fair point. What do you think is going wrong, Thabo? Because what I'm trying to get us to is how to fix it. So what do you see as the problem? Because I do see young people in the newsroom. I do see a lot of young people in the newsroom. And it may be that they're writing in a language that senior people are directing. I don't know. What do you think it is? What might be going wrong? Because some of these are your peers who you're studying with that are doing internships.
Thank you. I think just to touch on the issue of young people, it's where young people are in these particular platforms, not just in the media space across the country. I think young people are not given the necessary, important roles to be able to shape narratives. Yes, they are there in the newsroom, but what role are they playing in that particular part? You're saying for the most part they're interns. How many young people are producers, for instance? How many young people are directors, for instance? And I think the translation from intern to producer to editor to director is where we need to begin to streamline young people, across those various aspects. In terms of anchoring, how many young people are anchors? Not just anchors at 11 o'clock show when nobody's watching, on primetime news media and so forth. How many young people are given those important roles and those important responsibilities? And I think once you begin to streamline, young people across various, decision-making positions, will be able to see a shift in the language, a shift in the change of thinking and so forth. But for the most part, it is an issue of ageism, across the sector, not just in politics where you have people above the age of 60, above the age of retirement age, still participating in the daily affairs that affect young people. It's across we have an issue of ageism in the country, across various sectors, and undermining young people and the capacity that young people can bring about in terms of bringing this change that we all envision. So it's not that young people are not there, it's not that young people are not qualified, it's not that young people are not skilled. It's just that young people are not given there are many red tapes that prevent young people from really being able to be the decision makers and the drivers of change. Once you have a more youthful voice, given those particular opportunities, I'm pretty sure the issue of young people and how their voices are represented will begin to shift. And we've seen it more often than not with our activists who are former activists who become, interns. For the most part, how we even find, platforms on the media is through those particular young channels.
Right.
And I was saying if we have more of that is being implemented, then slowly but surely, I mean, we'll be able to change how the voices of young people who are the majority of this country, the majority of the continent, will begin to shift even in the media space.
All right. Zulaikha, what are the consequences of this misrepresentation, this writing that doesn't tell the story properly about the youth?
Mm-hmm. The consequences of this misrepresentation is that it pushes young people back further, whereas then young people are no longer heard fully because of this misrepresentation, and it contributes to the ageism which Thabo has just mentioned. It contributes largely to adding on to that issue, and so then it sets young people even further back. And it also further contributes onto us not moving forward as a country as well, because then the issue is completely misunderstood, and issues are like largely misunderstood, and so it contributes to not just setting young people back further, but it contributes to setting the entire country back further, largely in terms of two of the most important things in the country that we're being challenged with: the issue of access to higher education and the issue of unemployment. It sets us back further, because as we know, the youth unemployment rate is currently at its highest right now. So this misrepresentation sets us back even further. And when you set young people back, you set the entire country at large back.
Okay. Is that something you agree with, Thabo?
I mean, I surely agree. The youth of any country are the future. So a country that doesn't invest in its youth is a country that doesn't deserve its future. So it is correct in saying the more we destigmatize and we set the youth at a back foot, we're not setting just the youth at a back foot, we're setting the whole country's development, and outward projection at a back foot. So I think that more needs to be done in terms of, the investment into the youth, who are the future of the country. So the investment into the youth, into their initiatives, into their projects. I mean, for instance, Zulaikha herself, is one of an astounding young person. She's an author at a very young age of a book. So it's about those particular stories. We mustn't just cover. When I last met Zulaikha, when I first heard of Zulaikha, it was during the time when she was at Pretoria Girls High, when she was during a protest. It's the issue I'm talking about. She made mainstream media through a protest, but there's more to young people. Today she's an author. We don't see her across the media platforms advertising that particular aspect of her work. But if Zulaikha was to go lead a protest now, I'm pretty sure every news media agency would be able to want to have a glimpse of her in that particular aspect. So I'm saying it's those kind of ways that we portray the young people. Let's change the narrative. Let's be intentional in our changing of the narrative, and not just being intentional. Let's be transformative. Let's transform the voice. I want to represent young people, but it requires us to be intentional as well.
All right.
In that aspect.
So let me ask you this, and then I'll ask Zulaikha. Who are you trying to convince through the media? Because the fact of the matter is, young people are not consuming mainstream media as much as they used to, and they're on Twitter, they're on TikTok, they're on social media, and this is where a lot of the communication takes place and sharing of ideas and thoughts. So is it that we are not paying attention to the right media to get the right voices, or is it that you don't need to worry about us because you have bigger platforms to communicate your message?
I mean, firstly, let's just go back to the media in and of itself. I mean, traditionally, the media would be seen as the fourth estate, or the fourth estate of the state, right? In terms of holding the state accountable and so forth. But for the most part, it has lost that element of it. A lot of different perspectives being presented across the media, untruths and so forth. The challenge of social media, like you're mentioning, that the rise of Twitters and the Instagram and so forth. So the media needs to change and transform to meet those particular targets. But more often than not, the social media has played a meaningful role for young people in terms of shaping what appears on mainstream media. And we've seen it in things like Fees Must Fall. It was social media hashtags and so forth that young people were activating to speak for themselves, to shape their own voices, which eventually made it to mainstream media. So, I mean, it is an interesting challenge that it's not, I don't consider it a challenge, it's an opportunity rather for the media itself to transform. Because the media gets most of its news from social media, and that's where most of the young people are active in that particular sense. So it's about transforming and understanding society. We're becoming a very digital society. So news comes to my fingertips very quickly than it would ordinarily in the past through a newspaper and the TV and the radio. So it's about transforming in that aspect, but also, creating the synergies between social media, what happens on social media, because anyone on social media can speak about anything, and the facts behind the matter, and being able to streamline the two different worlds together to bring about more meaningful information to shape public opinion. It's not about convincing people. It's about shaping the correct public opinion in order to be able to shape correct policy, positions.
Okay. Zulaikha, does it matter what the media thinks if you have a very powerful tool such as social media to get your point across? And as Thabo was saying, you're actually forcing a conversation, a narrative through social media.
Social media has been a very powerful tool for young people. As Thabo has mentioned, that social media was very powerful for Season of 4, and in my regard, it was also very powerful for Pretoria Girls High in 2016 at the time. And so social media does ultimately force you to report a story. However, I'm of the belief that as much as social media is a big platform that does ultimately influence how a story is going to be written, equally, the media is still quite a big factor in influencing the state as well, and also reaching those that are alienated from social media because of the issue of not being able to access internet connection.
All right. So here's a question for you, and because we've got local government elections coming up, and this is for both of you. Let me start with you, Thabo. Local government elections are coming up, and one of the things that we always worry about is, are young people going to show up? Are they going to vote? And for some reason, they just haven't been showing up in the numbers that they ought to, because if you all voted, you could change the political landscape and get what you want. But for some reason, you don't show up to the polls. Is it because of the media? What is it?
I mean, it's a number of factors. I spoke to ageism. For the most part, many of our public representatives are very old. So it's disencouraging for a young person to go to the polls every now and then to vote for somebody who is 60, who's 65, who's going to decide on their particular future. But one thing I have seen quite interesting, over the last few weeks and so forth, and again, it's an issue I've seen on social media, is young people are really coming out in their numbers in terms of taking charge or availing themselves for those particular positions for ward council. You speak of local government elections. If you go on Twitter, on anything, you'll see various hashtags, Mochapalong, young person to the front. And you're seeing many young people taking over or availing themselves as candidates, in fact, for ward councillor, for PR councillor. And I think that is going to create an interesting shift, because I've seen a number of people who have been elected already to stand as ward councillors across various wards which are going to by-elections. And I think that alone is creating a new shift to say young people are awakening to the realization that no. This thing of parliament or being a retirement home, or of our legislators being a retirement home, has come to an end, because for the most part it is us young people who are being affected by these particular policy makers and decision makers. So they're really coming to the party. It will be interesting to see over the next few months how that is going to translate in terms of the numbers in local government elections itself. But I think young people are really coming out strong. It's not about them not being available. It's about them always being denied the space because of their age. And I think we are coming to a point of saying enough is enough. And I think that is going to be an interesting factor in terms of this local government elections and in terms of the national elections that are coming up. I mean, many other countries are producing presidents who are 40, presidents who are 36, and it's about time that South Africa begins to invest quite deeply into that. But we have a serious issue of ageism in our country that needs to be, addressed quite thoroughly. Of course, this conversation is a bit, the time is constraining us to have this conversation, but how South Africa's moral fabric of ageism needs to be addressed quite, interestingly, in terms of bringing about the meaningful change that we want and bring about a more youthful representation.
All right, Thabo, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Zulaikha, we've run out of time, but a final thought for you, because I'm just wondering, as I say, these local government elections are on the way, very, very important. Youth vote is a game changer. Is it the media that's perhaps not helping, or other issues at play?
You know, because Thabo has just touched on one of the big factors being ageism, I'll also touch on one factor, is that the fact that it's very disencouraging for a young person who has just turned 18 and is now legally allowed to vote, when for the entire 18 years, for an entire 12 years of their schooling, their basic education schooling, they've not been encouraged to have a voice politically, to have a voice in terms of addressing the challenges of our democracy, and they've not been introduced to any form of having a voice around issues challenging the country. And so when they then turn 18 and they see no representation, and already there's the factor of ageism, and they're made to feel insignificant in terms of having a voice to shape the landscape of the country, it's very disencouraging for them to then go to the polls and vote. And so I believe that we have to start very, very young, and there has to be a factor whereby we begin in the space of basic education, whereby we introduce young children to the challenges of our democracy, and we begin to teach them about these values and factors in basic education, so that by the time that they leave school, 12 years of schooling, and they turn 18, they're prepared and encouraged to go to polls, and they understand what lies in going to the polls, because it's very also unfair for young people to not be taught that and to be excluded from that, and also see no representation. So ultimately, psychologically, there's this shift where they see themselves as insignificant and then expect them to also just go to the polls. And so it has to begin in education, and also young people need to be heard more, and not just only seen in Youth Month in June. Young people need to be heard.
Zulaikha, Patel, a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. And hopefully we'll catch up with you both again soon. Thanks so much. All right, so voices of two very powerful young people, firm ideas, good ideas, and perhaps we need to find ways to give them more time like this on these platforms. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, the Tembisa 10 story just won't go away. And I'm going to say that in this past week, I'm even more confused at what might have happened. Stay with us for more on that. The story of the Tembisa decuplets, that's 10 children at one go, continues to be a hot topic in South Africa, the media, and ever since the announcement of the multiple births by independent media, no one has seen the 10 babies. The past Monday, it was reported that Khoisame Sitole's partner, Teboho Tsotsetse, had not yet seen the babies himself and was not sure about the whereabouts of Sitole or the children. Meanwhile, the South African Editors Forum has slammed the coverage of the alleged birth of the decuplets in Tembisa. And according to SANEF, there's been a complete collapse of journalistic ethics and standards, calling journalist Piet Rampedi reckless and irresponsible. Well, for a little bit more on that, let's be joined by SANEF's Hopewell Radebe. Hopewell, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you. I have to say that this story, I'm no clearer 2 weeks later than when it first started. Is that what concerns you the most, that you hear one version, you hear another version, and there doesn't seem to be any finality with something that really should be straightforward?
Good morning, Peter, and good morning to all the listeners. Yeah, we wish the story would have been finalized by now. But for me, I think the health department may have put the final nail in the coffin. Popo Maja, the director for communication, has issued a statement with the health department in general saying that there's not been any birth of the children, not anywhere recorded, not in the hospitals. I know that the health department in Gauteng said that almost a week ago. But what really helps now is that we are getting information that even the health department believes that the lady had not given birth. So we cannot dispute that, because from the beginning you would have expected that our brothers in the Pretoria News would have wanted to know who's the doctor that's going to handle this, and which hospital it is, because in the beginning they said it was a hospital in Pretoria. The next thing, they were blaming the health department, saying that it should come up with the truth and say what has happened to the children, as if they were ever born at all. So it has been a very unfortunate situation. It has, for us, it is one of the lowest marks in our journalism issues, particularly issues of accuracy and ethics in journalism. We are hoping that the media industry itself, what you call the independent, because it has its own ombuds system, that at least they will do a proper investigation and tell us what has happened, why were there such serious lapses in the verification of information when the story was being published repeatedly, I must say.
Well, they are sticking by the story, and this last week they published a story suggesting that there's a massive government cover-up, almost suggesting that there could have been negligence around these children, and that these babies were born.
Yeah, I'm aware, because we've been following this, Peter, very closely. In general, any story that gets published, it is not the business of SANEF to be investigating or checking anything, not at all. But what made this story make us comment is because of the continuation, the continued attempt to make this story live longer than it should have when there was no evidence at all to suggest that there has been such birth. And indeed, at one stage, the story turned around and they blamed the mother for hiding the children from the husband, or from the father, so it's not the husband. And then the family issued two different statements. At the beginning, they were happy that the children are alive and the mother, then they were asking where are the children themselves. So it continued to a point where the public pressure on us to tell whether the story is true or not could not be ignored anymore. So, which is why then SANEF had to come and say something. Usually it would not be a matter at all. And in many stories, either they go to the press council to be adjudicated, or the broadcasting complaints commission, if it's a broadcast story. And you know that the platforms have merged these days. Even the media, print media, also have their own videos that they put on their online. So there is a talk about how the adjudication should go on and what you call the verification should go on. But that's a different story altogether. It will be resolved eventually. But now we are just facing this story that somehow the independent continues to pretend as if it's a true story. And if anything, it is just unfortunate, really, that we are getting to the point where, even editors would then be investigated as to what was their motive behind such a continued lie to be carried true and true.
This time last week, we were talking about the same story, and I remember there was a lot of outrage at the attacks that Piet Rampedi was facing, and they suggested that if it had been a white journalist, he would have been believed, and that this was just going after a black person.
It's nonsense, really. Every time we're supposed to face our realities and our problems, we always drag in the race card. It's absolute nonsense. There are times we just have to man up and be able to say, I have done wrong, I've done this and that. And even members of the public, criticism is always welcome. So challenge us on the basis of our competence. Do not shy away to say, Hopewell, you messed up here, I'm disappointed or I'm angry. It is okay to say that. But do not then turn around and say, because it's Hopewell, therefore I should be careful not to be seen to be criticizing the brother. How many years after democracy are we going to continue shielding ourselves and behind the race card? I think there just come a time we just have to take responsibility as the house of African communities and be able to take the criticism that we're supposed to have. And I would not mind if I am criticized by whoever for the wrongs that I've done and be challenged to apologize if I must, and if I should be jailed, let me be jailed for it. If I've committed a crime that deserves me to be behind bars. I mean, we see this even in politics. We find people being afraid to criticize this leader or that leader because, hey, you are therefore seen as, turning against your own. I don't think we will grow as a society if we continue to take or to do this. Being black does not and should not mean that I cannot falter, I cannot do wrong. I should be challenged by the elders, by my peers, and even in this case, Rampedi should be able to take the punch and be able to say, guys, I may have slipped here, and I apologize if he should. And his own peers should be the one that guides our standards, and that means other editors, that means even his own staff should be able to say, but chief, this is, we may have messed up here, seriously. It will make us grow stronger if we are that kind of a society that can take responsibility for our own actions.
What do you see as the consequences of this whole episode? You've described it as one of the lowest points in journalistic history in South Africa. What could be the fallout consequences for journalism in general?
If you look at what has happened to other colleagues in the past, let's say in the Sunday Times, some journalists had lost their jobs for such a breach, let's say, of standards and of processes within their own newsrooms. Apologize. Okay. A number of them had lost their jobs and had others maybe after 2 or 3 years in the wilderness, they got jobs and started working again, hoping that they'd land. It is not for me to say what Piet should do. He's mature enough, and he's an editor now in chief, and he would have written an editorial and asked a politician to resign, to get out, for such breaches. So let's hope that he would do some introspection and act appropriately on his own. But it is up to the owners of the Independent to deal with him and see how they see fit. But remember, they have to first investigate, and then the due process should happen. And we are not asking for summary actions, like if there's a Congo court. We think that proper steps will be taken by the newspaper concerned or the owners of the industry of that sector and act appropriately.
Could there be reputational harm to the newspaper group, because then people will start to say other stories, we have to check those now? Or is this just a one-off, do you think?
In times like this, you wish that the public would say, it's just the once-off. But you are right, there is a reputational consequence for this, because people start taking it broader and look at what happened. Thabo wrote a piece for the News 24 and reminded us of the consequences that happened to a journalist in the United States who worked for the New York Times. When one story was found that he had plagiarized, has stolen some information and then wrote it as if he had done his own investigation. They then investigated all his stories and looked at what happened. Unfortunately for him, they found a pattern of how he had written or sourced information about other stories, and they found that he had done this for a period of 2 years.
Wow.
He was trusted. When he came with the stories to the editors, they respected him. He presented information, and they liked that. And they published, only to find that he had plagiarized a lot and taken information somewhere and lied in some instances and created codes he had not even investigated and properly done the job. So there was a serious consequence. To this day, he's not even in the field as a journalist anymore, and that was a serious consequence. So I hope that in answering you, I'm saying that it does happen, that people will then want to see that have you checked on other stories? Have all the stories been good? You recall that Piet is also one of those journalists who worked for worked for the Sunday Times and had dealt with the stories of investigating the SARS. And you remember the big story of the rogue units in SARS. And to this day, he still believes, he tries to stand and say that he had done due diligence. So it's one of those things. It will make people wonder whether, some of us in the industry, do we have remorse? Do we learn from our mistakes? And yes, it leads to that element where people then start wondering about the whole industry. So the reputation is not just for the independent or just for the person concerned. It affects all of us. It affects you, where you are standing. And people will wonder when you are reading the news, when you are doing your job, whether this is true or not. They start taking everything with a pinch of salt. The reputation of the media in South Africa right now is in serious trouble. We just had a conference in May where we were looking at these matters.
Hopewell, sadly, we've run out of time, but I think we've got the gist of what you wanted to say. And thank you very much indeed for sharing your thoughts with us on the program today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. All right, that's a long-time journalist, Hopewell Radebe, who's with the South African National Editors Forum, sharing his thoughts on the Tembisa 10. Yeah, I hope by this time next week this story will be done. In the meantime, the Committee to Protect Journalists has announced the 2021 International Press Freedom Awards. 4 courageous journalists from Belarus, Guatemala, Mozambique and Myanmar have been recognized for reporting during a historically turbulent time, covering protests and political upheaval in their countries. Joel Simon, who's the CPJ Executive Director, says that in the midst of a battle over the control of information, these journalists are on the side of people, covering events, informing communities and ensuring accountability, and have paid the price, confronting violence, harassment, repression and persecution, but refusing to back down. The 4 are Katerina Beresevich from Belarus, Anastasia Meja from Guatemala, Aye Chang Naing from Myanmar, Matthias Gente from Mozambique. Gente, who's not a stranger to this program, is the executive editor of Canal de Mozambique, an independent weekly investigative newspaper, and its daily digital publication, Canal Moz. Over the years, he's faced a myriad of threats for his hard-hitting reporting, including police interrogations, charges of violation of state secrecy and conspiracy against the state, and an attempted kidnapping in 2019. And in 2020, unidentified individuals set the outlet's offices ablaze. He, alongside their awardees, have stood firm for press freedom and independent journalism. Welcome back. You're still watching Media Monitor. Now, for a look at the local newspapers. To discuss today's newspapers, I'm now joined by journalist and photographer at the Bloemfontein Courant, Piers van Heerden. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Piers. Always good to talk to you. Which paper grabbed your attention first today?
Good morning, Peter. Thank you for having me again this morning. I think something that caught my attention definitely has to be the report. The front page reports on the basic Minister of Education, Ndoro, announced yesterday on 19 June that all schools in South Africa will remain open despite the surge of the COVID-19. Now, the story grabbed my attention because despite the warning of medical experts, the minister decided not to only keep open the schools in Gauteng, but schools all across South Africa. Now, Gauteng province has about 6,000 positive cases per day, which is about 14% more than we had in the second wave. Now, that's quite alarming, Peter. And the South African Medical Association also advised that schools in the province in Gauteng now should close for about 3 weeks to help lower the spread of the coronavirus. But despite that, the minister did decide to keep the schools open. Now, she did earlier announce that about 582,000, teachers and teaching staff will be vaccinated over a 2-week period, which will formally start on 23 June. And I think although the teachers will be vaccinated, more cases of children between the age of 10 and 14 years are coming to light now. And this is alarming because we need to remember that these kids need to still go home to their parents and to the elderly, which puts them in danger because they are at a higher risk, And locally, we report on this every day in Bloemfontein. We see today more and more cases in schools, and one specific school in Bloemfontein is actually protesting at the moment because of the spike in cases.
Wow. All right, and then very briefly, the next story, because we're running out of time.
When it comes to the information. And I do think if you decide to close school, we should have a plan, and for all schools, all LSMs.
All right. Piers, I think we're struggling with your signal, so we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks very much indeed. I think this will certainly be a talking point for many people. This idea of going back to schools. Is it safe? Should people not be playing safer and staying at home? All right, that's how we come to the end of this week's edition of Media Monitor. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Join us again next week at the same time. In the meantime, please be safe. Do all the protocols, including wearing a mask. Take care.